Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. Before we get to today's episode, we want to take a quick moment and let you know that CityWorks Expo 8, anticipating 2050, acting today, will be occurring October 4th through 6th in Roanoke, Virginia. We've got some really exciting speakers and some other activities lined up that we're excited about. If you all are interested, please check us out at cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. And real quick, before we get to today's episode, just want to let you all know that we'd really appreciate if you could give us a rating and review on whatever platform you're listening to this, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever else you might be finding it. This rating and review really help other people find out about the podcast and the incredible guests that we have. But now, without further ado, let's get on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Mr. Aaron Renn, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. How are you doing today, Aaron?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, it's an absolute pleasure. I've been following you both through your website and on Twitter for quite a while, so it's a pleasure to get a chance to chat with you today.
Likewise.
Well, so I wonder if we could kind of start off with, you've got this Urbanophile. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there, but I wonder if you could kind of define what your work is, more broadly speaking, and kind of how you define it is, what it is that you do.
That's interesting because the two questions I always get from people when they meet me is first, how do you find time to write so much material? I mean, how do you crank out so much work? Secondly, is what is it that you actually do? I think is one of the questions, and I used to get that going back to my consulting days. I started out as a consultant in the corporate world with Accenture, so I worked for Accenture for about 15 years and was a partner when I left there. And we always used to say, like, the hardest part of your job working as in corporate consulting is explaining to your parents what it is that you actually do during the day. But fundamentally, I see myself as someone who's very much in the consulting, still somewhat the consulting frame of analysis in what I do. I apply the tools, techniques, and disciplines of management consulting practices to the problems of the city in an attempt to create new insights and to create tools that local and predominantly local and state leaders can use to help better think about their communities and what they ought to be doing. So I'm a bit of a hybrid of a researcher and a journalist, and so I write research papers. I do some traditional journalism work, but a lot of it is really, to me, I have my own ideas about what cities and localities should be doing, but ultimately, in most places, I don't live in most places, right? I only live on the Upper West Side of New York. And so the leaders in those communities have to be the ones who ultimately take responsibility for make the decisions. And so what I want to do is help to equip them with the best set of kind of conceptual tools and analysis that they can use to make their own decisions about what's right for their community.
Well, I'm kind of intrigued about this idea of bringing this management consulting world to bear on this community change or city building world. And is that a skill set that you've seen that hasn't been particularly predominant in that world so far?
Yeah, well, I do. I don't. I sort of say that, like, kind of what's unique about what I do. I sort of frame it that way. I'm not a consultant, so I don't do paid projects for cities. I want to be clear on that. But I'm sort of thinking about the world through that lens. And, I think that the city world has been completely different from the corporate world in most respects. So, for example, if you look at the functions that make up what the domains of urban policy, virtually all of them have their own very specialized practitioner class of professional services people and experts, almost all of whom are very technically oriented type people. What do I mean by that? Civil engineers design roads, planners design zoning codes, architects design buildings, teachers do teaching. So there's people who are kind of technical experts in the domain that they are, but there's not necessarily a lot of thinking about the types of things that, say, a corporate CEO would think about, particularly brand, talent, strategic positioning in the marketplace, that sort of thing. The kind of the value proposition to your customer. And one of the ways that this manifests itself is in the way that cities try to brand themselves and portray themselves in the marketplace. I'm always struck that while every company tries its hardest to convince you of how much different and better it is than every other company in its industry, every city tries its hardest to convince you that it is exactly the same as every other city that is conventionally considered cool. Right? So you think about like Apple Computer. They literally had a marketing campaign called Think Different. And they said, we're going to actually innovate. That's what they did. They innovated. They created entire new product categories like MP3 players and smartphones. They really focused on high-quality industrial design. Now, today, a lot of the marketplaces imitated them. But, they really went their own way and, as a result, captured really a premium share of the market in terms of the highest value consumer segments. Whereas you look at cities, they're always trying to sell themselves as, what do we have? We have bike lanes. We have startups. We've got microbreweries. We've got these great coffee shops now. We've got farm-to-table restaurants. We have a fashion scene, right? We've got guys with beards and tattoos and all the same stuff you do. And you know what? There is nothing wrong with any of those things. I actually think all of those things are great. I think cities need to have a lot of those things. If you don't have, a bike infrastructure or a place to get a decent cup of coffee today, you are in trouble. But fundamentally, those are the exact same things that everybody else is pushing. You think about, say, what those call to mind. You think of Portland or Brooklyn. Well, what is the likelihood that your city is going to out Portland or out Brooklyn? Not very high. So you sort of have to think about what's unique about your place and come up with a way to position it in the marketplace that helps it to stand out. So that's the sort of thinking that I think. I think there's a lot of kind of conventional wisdom thinking in urban policy where sort of something becomes a best practice and everybody just kind of gloms onto it, and very little original thinking. And I understand that the political incentives make it difficult. I mean, people who stick their neck out with something, try to do something different, if it doesn't work out, then, you get a problem on election day, right? So I want to be, respectful of the political realities. And corporations also, there was an old saying, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. And people, there is a tendency in many places to play it safe, but I'm trying to say, how could we think differently about these places? How could we unearth competitive advantages that they never had before and never thought of before?
That's really fascinating because I have to confess, we're based in Roanoke, Virginia, and so we're always trying to figure this out. How do we become Asheville? How do we become Pittsburgh? How do we learn from those things? And it really is, replicating those is going to be impossible, and you're never going to be better than them at their own game. So how have you, when you look at cities that have had success in establishing clear identities of their own that are distinct and valuable, how have they been able to do that well?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of times it wasn't necessarily a conscious strategy. It sort of just came about as a chain of kind of decisions over time that didn't just create a marketing strategy. It created a reality that is very different in those places. And it often took decades. I mean, this is the thing people don't want to hear. It took decades to establish. So if you think about Portland created its urban growth boundary in the 1970s. And I believe it was originally intended to protect farmland from development. It really wasn't about urbanization. They built their light rail line in the 80s. So they made some decisions that were different from other cities going back, 40 plus years. And now, later, Portland is this boomtown. You think, oh, we need to do something like that. Well, in the 1970s, to have done what they did, and in the 1980s, it was probably by no means clear that that was actually a good idea to do, and it took a long time to really pay results. You could think the same thing about Austin, Texas. Its tech industry goes back into the 60s and 70s, and investments there. The music industry there goes back a long way with stuff like Austin City Limits. I don't even know when that debuted, probably in the 70s or 80s. So a lot of that goes back a long way. Country music in Nashville has been around since the 20s. So a lot of things that drive the identity of a place, whether it be a university, for example, a lot of them are just very, very historic, and they came about from just a series of almost disconnected decisions that then kind of gelled into a strategy. One of the best ones that I like to cite is the Indianapolis sports strategy. So today everybody thinks, oh well, let's try to host a Final Four game or a Super Bowl, and it'll be an economic development play for our city. It'll give us great exposure, et cetera. Well, that's been kind of done for a while, but really, if you think about it, back in like the 70s, in the 80s, that was far, far less. The Olympics, people tried to get the Olympics, but cities really didn't compete to host events in the way that they do today. Well, Indianapolis started with some campaigns to save their NBA team, the Indiana Pacers, and then it sort of morphed into a strategy of saying, why don't we try to focus on amateur sporting events in our city as a way to build kind of excitement around our brand. So in 1982, they hosted something called, I believe, the National Sports Festival, which is, I think you could think of it as equivalent to the Olympic trials type of thing. It was sort of a pre-Olympic sort of event, and they built a lot of things. They built a natatorium for swimming. They built a big track and field complex. They built a rowing course. In 1983, they built a domed stadium without a team to play in it. And as a result, the Colts moved to town a year later. Now, that was something that, today the idea that you would just do a build it and they will come on a stadium, you just can't do it, right? And the stadium that they built was a lot cheaper than today's stadiums. So they moved early in ways that other places didn't. They created the first sports commission in the United States. So the idea that there's a local entity, nonprofit entity, that is chartered by the city with bidding on hosting sporting events and putting them on, they basically created that model. Essentially, everyone has one today, but they created it. They hosted the Pan Am Games in 1987. And so they did a whole lot of stuff, especially in the 1980s, to build up on that. And it was 2012 or 2014. I can't remember what year they hosted the Super Bowl. They do that. They host the Final Four every few years. The NCAA is based there. They sought out all of these sports governing bodies. So, USA Track and Field, I think, is there. USA Rowing. A lot of the governing bodies are there. The NCAA is there. And so just all of these pieces and parts that they put together over the course of 40 years created something for them that was actually successful and enabled them to do it in a way that makes money, whereas I think in a lot of other places the sports business has almost been essentially a negative economic return. So that's an example of a community that built something. But one of the things I would say that they did that was very smart, and again, I would say they didn't just sit down in the 1970s and say let's create this master plan to win the war on sports. It sort of just came about over a series of discrete and investments and decisions, but it came out of the fact that sports was authentic to the city and to the people. So Indianapolis was best known for the Indianapolis 500, which had gone back to maybe 1911. So you had a tradition of sports there. High school basketball was always massive in Indiana. They made that Hollywood movie Hoosiers with Gene Hackman back in the day, which talked about which is essentially a retelling of a legendary time when a tiny high school won the state championship. And so when you do something like that, the people sort of buy into it because they could handle sports. If they had tried to build a light rail line in the 1980s the way Portland did, it would have been like, what? Nobody ever would have gone for that. They couldn't have become the vegan capital of the United States. It just wouldn't have worked. So you have to do something that is sort of resonant with the local culture, and they did that. But that's an example of a community that went out and essentially made a series of very smart strategic investments that paid off for them over time and ultimately turned them from essentially a backwater, no place into a city that is sort of written about in the papers. They were just in the New York Times, big article about them because of the Amazon HQ2 finalist, and that was really a catalyst for change for them.
Well, so I'm intrigued now. The bigger question then around this question of building identities and branding yourself is what are you hoping to accomplish by that in some ways? And so obviously there are clear benefits in terms of publicity and things like that, maybe even attracting businesses, things like that. Are there? How do you kind of lay down the benefits for a community that is doing this well? What are they aiming to do?
Well, first off, they're doing it, whether they claim they're doing it or not. I mean, just states alone spend something like $700 million a year on just tourism marketing. Every community has a convention and visitors bureau chartered with marketing the community of visitors. They also have economic development groups. So whether you consciously think of it as a branding strategy or not, you are attempting to convince people to move to your town, and you are attempting to convince businesses to move to your town, and you are trying to convince tourists and other people to come to your town. And in every case, you're making a pitch to them. And that pitch for them is based on a concept of what you think that your community is and what you want them to believe that it is. So you're essentially making I always say a brand is a promise delivered. You're making a promise to someone. If you come to Roanoke and visit our town, here is what you will experience. And so you're attempting to reach the people that are going to value that experience. So you have to make a promise that is true, for one thing. So I think one of the biggest advantages of thinking about branding the right way is avoid shooting yourself in the foot. So, if every city in America now is saying, well, we're going to be like a biotech hub. Well, the reality is most of them are not going to be biotech hubs. So if you say we're going to be the next Silicon Valley, we're going to be the next biotech hub, we're going to be a center of this industry or that industry, and you have no prospect of doing it, then you're going to fail miserably. And those failures not only waste a lot of money, but they breed cynicism in the local communities. I mean, I don't know your community. So many communities in America are full of very cynical citizens because they've seen so many redevelopment schemes flop, right, over the years. And so getting it right, I think, is really important in that measure. And I think part of it is when you think about these things, this is the sort of thing that companies think about, again, that cities don't. It's what customer are we best positioned to serve? Who's our customer? Now, again, there's a huge difference between companies and cities in that cities have to be open to all comers. You can't just curate your citizenry. Whatever business wants to come to town can, with whatever people want to come to town. And you had to provide basic services to everybody. But there's got to be, demographics or business segments that you have much more advantages at than others, and those are the ones you can target. Right now, one thing that everybody and their brother is going after is we want college-educated millennials. Mm-hmm. That is the single most competitive segment to attract in the entire country. And so you got to ask, it's nothing wrong with getting your fair share of those, but are you going to become a destination for that versus other places? Particularly today, with the millennials are essentially over. We're moving into Generation Z, which is much smaller. So it's actually a shrinking market. Young, educated people is going to be a shrinking market just because there's fewer total people. So I might ask, rather than saying, that's the focus of everything that we do, maybe there are other places, there are other groups of people who are not being served so well that might actually find my community, a good place to live. One great example of this, I think, was Atlanta. Back in the day, Atlanta wanted to become the capital of the New South. But one of the things that they did is, again, whether it was intentional or not, who knows, but they ultimately realized that essentially Black America was an underserved market. Who is trying to target, Blacks to come here and build a future in this city? Basically, you don't hear a lot of cities talking about that. You hear a lot of talk about equity in race, but you don't hear a lot of talk about people saying, how can we make, our minority communities an economic engine for our community? Well, Atlanta essentially did that. They became the essentially capital of Black America, and the city boomed. And by the way, it didn't just boom for black people; it boomed for everyone. And they did do some things. Certainly, some things they did do consciously because they kind of coined this phrase back in the day: "The city too busy to hate," and really focused on shedding some of the negative racial, legacies of the South. And so they made a big focus on that, whereas other cities like Birmingham, Alabama, did not do that. And today, Birmingham is still a struggling post-industrial city. Atlanta and Birmingham were almost the same size in 1950, but the trajectory has been totally different. And Atlanta, having a much more forward-looking view on race, I think was one of the distinguishing factors. So that's an example. Another city was Akron, Ohio. I was just there last week. Post-industrial city, saying, who's gonna essentially repopulate parts of our city that have been depopulated. Well, it turned out, again, somewhat serendipitously, that it became a big center, maybe the primary center in America for resettlement of Bhutanese, Nepali refugees. So, I don't know the whole story there, but I believe there was a Nepali minority in Bhutan, and they were, they had fled the country. They were in refugee camps, and so a lot of them were resettled into the United States and ended up in, for whatever reason, I'm not sure exactly the genesis, ended up in Akron. So they've got now this community of people who are, sort of, reviving, slowly rebuilding homes and such in certain neighborhoods in their city. I mean, who would have ever thought that, the Nepali Bhutanese community would be would be your engine of population growth, but that happened. So it's like there's all these overlooked people and all these overlooked businesses that don't necessarily get a lot of love. And so where could you, particularly if you're a smaller city like Roanoke and you don't necessarily, New York's going to be able to get, whomever they want. Bay Area is going to be able to get whomever they want. Who can you get? I mean, what do you offer? And it may be somebody, you've never really even thought about. So those are the sorts of things that I think cities ought to be thinking about more, rather than just saying, because there's a whole lot of people, not that there's anything wrong with educated millennials, but there are a whole lot of other people in the world.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. It is interesting. I was here in Roanoke. There's obviously that shift on young people is there, and it drives me a little nuts as one of those group myself. But it's also interesting that there's starting to be some move towards the retired population as well, which I think if you were to pick a second most sought after group, that's probably that one right there. But I do.
Yeah, that would be one that I might think that if you've got, I don't know what's in. I know nothing about Roanoke, but I wouldn't be as a smaller community, kind of in the somewhat southern U.S. You probably have some potentials. One of the nice things about being a smaller community is that you don't need to attract huge quantities of people in order to make a big difference. So you think about Detroit, for example. Just the city of Detroit alone lost 1 million people. So, in an incredible, hundreds of thousands of jobs. So you can take a guy like Dan Gilbert, the local billionaire who's been buying up all these properties and investing. He moved 5,000 employees of his main business, Quicken Loans, into downtown Detroit. That's a big deal, 5,000 people. But think about 5,000 people in Roanoke. what that would be like a game changer versus 5,000 people in Detroit. It's a big impact, but the city is so vast. You would say, wow, that's like barely a start. Right, is what's needed there. So being smaller has some advantages. You're more nimble. You don't need to attract huge. You can do better with niche markets than perhaps other places can. You don't need to target a huge market because you don't need huge quantities of people.
Well, it has been interesting. We've been one of the economic development drivers for the area has really put a lot of focus onto outdoor recreation and making that the cultural identity of the area. And it's been I would argue, a fairly massive success in that way. And I think it's been really good for the region. And yet there's also been some conversations about having so much energy focused on that identity outward and not enough focus inward. And I imagine we're not the only community that's facing those kinds of questions.
Right. I think there's part of it. I do think that's one of the reasons I say, with Indianapolis and sports, they picked something that resonated locally with the community. Sometimes I think it is a challenge because you have to get it somewhat right. And this is more art than science. You have people who live in a community, and so a lot of times, when you talk about, well, we need to lure all these, young millennials here, we need to lure these outsiders in, we need to lure this, the people who live there can say, what about me? And if you create essentially a narrative about the future, that of the place that doesn't include the people who live in it, or they're somewhat seen as, the past that needs to be shed, that can cause problems, and it can cause political problems trying to make things happen. So certainly that. Another thing that you often end up with, and this is different in the South than it is in the Midwest, which you see in the Midwest and northeastern kind of Rust Belt cities, is a lot of tremendous negativity, cynicism, shame, self-loathing in these communities. Like you'll hear people who live in a community and have no intention of leaving it, just badmouth it constantly. And it's like if a newcomer moves to one of these places, it's like, well, why would you want to live here? And you're like, what? Whereas I think in the South, you go to one of the secrets of places like Nashville and Charlotte. I mean, I go to these places, and you go to some of these cities and you see how just incredibly, essentially boastful they are. We're the greatest city in the world. We're on the way to being the number one city in America. And it's sort of like, sometimes I'm like, wow, you guys are like, you don't really have as much to brag about maybe as you think you do. But the psychology, right, of that sometimes can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in some places you sort of have to raise the morale, figure out how to raise the morale of the troops, if you will, from your locals. I think the idea of if you have an outdoor kind of recreation area, I think that's something that I would definitely be thinking about how you sell that. So, I mean, you say if it's been a massive success, I can believe it. Certainly places like Boulder and Portland and Seattle have done very well with that. And if it's legitimate to your community, there's nothing wrong. The idea that your community is going to be a totally unique, unlike everyone. Those are very rare places, but. So you don't have to. If outdoor recreation is legitimate there, then the fact that there are other places that also have outdoor recreation shouldn't stop you from talking about it. But that's one of inventorying what you've got and thinking about it. One thing. I mean, here's one thing, and I was just thinking about this in terms of. I was talking with someone the other day, and he was talking about, I think it was Durham, North Carolina. And how they were creating, the local distillers were trying to create local spirits using local grains and local this and local that. And it's like, how to be local? I'm like, well, you know what? When I think of Durham, North Carolina, this is the kind of outside the box thinking I would kind of like it. If you're thinking of Durham, North Carolina, I don't think of vodka and bourbon and this stuff. I think of cigarettes. I think of tobacco. And that's the same thing I would think of with Virginia. I'm like, why isn't there some type of artisanal tobacco products? And maybe there are. You just don't hear about these cities saying, we've got the best pipe tobacco or we've got the best cigars. Something that would be like, what is an authentic Virginia product? It's tobacco. And yet you don't see kind of the urban hipster types even though many of them smoke, well, believe it or not, I see plenty of hipsters who are smoking cigarettes every day. There seems to be no focus on finding that artisanal path. And the irony will be, once somebody in Brooklyn or Portland starts creating some artisanal, tobacco products that become hot, all of a sudden these legacy tobacco states will embrace it.
Huh.
Like that's probably a brand asset for Virginia that's going underexploited.
Well, it is interesting too, because I do think that there's a cultural shifts have made tobacco perhaps less acceptable, or absolutely made it less acceptable than it was 50 years ago. And I wonder, there's obviously these ebbs and flows and things. And so I look at some communities that are investing a ton of energy into local food and things like that. And that's obviously, it's going to pay dividends on a number of different levels. But I do wonder, is that perhaps putting too many eggs in one basket in some ways, in terms of that is not necessarily going to be the thing in 20 years that's going to be impactful and that you want your identity to rest on, because that the kind of cultural zeitgeist will have changed in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to that. I mean, definitely things are ephemeral. Will we go back to the days of everybody drinking, Bud, Miller, and Coors, and everybody, I don't know. You can't predict the future, but if you have some authentically local products with authentically local heritage that have been around a while, then figuring out how to embrace those, even if it's not like a big national hit, if it's something that's still good for you, then great. You know what I mean? And so I don't know what I don't know what your agricultural heritage actually is around there. But again, I just, I wouldn't necessarily, the fact that kind of cigarettes and tobacco are déclassé, which they are in urban circles, I wouldn't necessarily let that stop you from thinking about it. Lots of people do smoke, and they're going to continue to smoke. And, you don't necessarily need to, again, target the guy smoking 2 packs a day. It could be someone with a pipe, occasionally smoking a pipe. It could be the occasional cigar kind of person. I mean, look what Colorado's doing with pot. I mean, now everybody's like, oh, we want to be the hottest pot capitals, where we have the most liberal marijuana laws. And I'm like, is that really like, I'm not even sure that that's a great, wanting to have a community full of pot smokers. I don't know if that's really a great thing, frankly. But, people are going after that anyway. In a sense, it's just who decides what's cool. In a sense, you're a market taker on that, not a market maker. Brooklyn has the advantage of being in New York City, which is the cultural capital of America, which does that stuff. But you do need to think about that. If it's like we just need to create some local food scene where there's nothing before, where there was nothing before, then how much that will last if it's not rooted in something, I don't know. But I think people are going to, as long as the economy holds up, people are going to want to continue to eat better than they used to back in the day, just like they want better beer. Are there any interesting, unique local foods there, historic? Maybe,
Oh gosh, you put me on the spot here. Not that I know of. I mean, there's some traditional Southern things that I think we would point to. I mean, Virginia ham, but that's more the eastern side of the state than it is us out here. So
right. Yeah. Well, one thing, I'm from Indiana, which is why I know a lot about Indianapolis. One of the things that is like essentially the state food of Indiana is the breaded pork tenderloin sandwich. It's a gigantic, again, breaded pork tenderloin. Think about like a gigantic, country fried steak sort of thing. Only it's like a pork, breaded, beaten down pork tenderloin on a bun, with like the thing spreading out the tenderloin like about twice the size of the bun and all this stuff on it. And it's a deep fried calorie bomb, right? And what I find really interesting about that is, if you go to Indianapolis and all their kind of farm-to-table restaurants and all this, none of them seem to have tried to create a variation on the pork tenderloin sandwich, even though it's an authentic thing that they would have there. Whereas I think in Nashville, you probably read about this Nashville hot chicken or whatever it is. that they keep bragging about, some local dish. Well, actually, so one of my friends who's got deep family connections in Nashville, he basically claims that's effectively made up. He's like 25 years ago, nobody in Nashville knew what Nashville hot chicken was. It was there may have been some small amount of it somewhere, but Nashville essentially found some little dish and turned it into a thing. Even though it really wasn't a thing. Whereas in Indianapolis, they have a legitimate dish that like everybody knows what it is. Like even the hipsters probably have one at some, basically kind of sports bar kind of place occasionally. And yet kind of the hip and trendy restaurants and the people have never really embraced that or trying to turn it into kind of a hot local cuisine item, even though they could. And I don't know why they won't. I mean, that's one of the things I've written about. I mean, here's your great, potential local food item that you could be known for, sort of like Cincinnati chili. But I think there's also a lot of that where people just leave the best things that they've got, whether it be a deep fried breaded pork tenderloin sandwich, whether tobacco, could be anything. They sort of leave it on the floor because they think they have to be exactly like a Brooklyn hipster. We have to create the definition of local is like what's our local grain, that we're going to use to distill our bourbon. Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I love micro distillery stuff. I think it's great. But, in Kentucky, that's great because Kentucky's a bourbon producing state. In other places, it's you can do it, but what's the thing that you have? What's the thing that you have? And so how can you have the courage? Again, I could say I keep pounding on tobacco. I'm like, I don't smoke. I have no interest in tobacco, but I would just make the analogy to country music. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, if you'd gone to Nashville, Tennessee, it would have been very easy to make the case that no one will ever take us seriously as a city if we don't get out of this country music business. Because country music is about as downscale, redneck, not attractive thing that you can possibly imagine. But Nashville said, no, this is who we are. This is what we do. And they updated it for the future. It's not the same, as I like to say, it's Carrie Underwood. It's not Minnie Pearl. They've got a very different type of country music today. It's way more, way more star power, more Hollywood, more glitz, more poppy. You've got people like Taylor Swift coming out of that now is like the biggest pop star in the world. And, if they hadn't had the courage to stick with country music, they would have ended up, probably not as hot a city. They may have done well as a city, but they probably wouldn't be the hot destination that they are today because they've got something that's authentic and it's unique to them. And so that's what I would say, on that. Think about things, even if you think, well, gosh, nobody would ever want that. I just go to the Brooklyn thing again all the time. In the Midwest, I'm from the Midwest. People in the Midwest said, gosh, agriculture, that's old, it's dead. We can't be in agriculture, manufacturing, all this workwear, all this old like blue collar stuff. Get out of that business. We need to be knowledge economy. We need to be biotech, high tech. Chicago's a global city, man. We got to get out of this business. And yet you go to Brooklyn, what did they do? They started drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon. They started canning pickles. They started celebrating like urban agriculture, beekeeping, again, the workwear inspired clothing that a lot of these hipsters wear, and it's like now that sort of old school agro-industrial stuff, like making things with your hands, artisanal, like that became hip. The Midwest could have owned that. They could have owned it, but they refused to embrace it because it wasn't cool. And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. We have to get to the modern 21st century economy and be like these places. And then, Brooklyn says, okay, you don't want that stuff? We'll take it. Oh, now it's cool. So I think that there were so many opportunities missed and continue to be opportunities missed, like pork tenderloin sandwiches in Indianapolis. It just frustrates me to no end when you see things that could be like utilized far more than they are, that aren't. So look for the things that you're maybe most ashamed of in your community and say, what are the things about our community that we're most ashamed of? Actually, there's probably some buried treasure in there. Some of it is probably legitimately bad. I think, again, I'm not going to say everything is that you're ashamed of is good. So Atlanta, again, was ashamed about, their racist legacy. They said about changing that. So you need to do some of those things. But thinking about, the things that you're ashamed of, maybe there's something like that Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, in there that you can say, well, maybe there's actually some things that we could figure out how to dust that off and turn it into something.
I do wonder, so let's say you are successful. If you're in Indianapolis, you become this hub for sports, and people know this about you, and it really digs into your cultural identity that you already have, and it's a sustainable way of doing things. How do you make sure that when all these people come in, that you're spreading that positive benefit throughout the community, and it's not going to the same folks that always seem to wind up benefiting from these kind of things?
Well, what I would say is, the two-tier economy is really an artifact of national, kind of national macroeconomic and technological conditions. Income inequality and the like is, I think that is in many cases not. There's a limited amount of that is a result of purely local decision making. So yes, I do believe that housing policy on the coasts has dramatically exacerbated income inequality. But ultimately today, a lot of the historic middle class came from occupations that are now in dramatic decline around manufacturing because of globalization and new technology, or in even a lot of service occupations. A lot of white collar or kind of jobs now are done. I worked in the information technology business at Accenture. There's now hundreds of thousands of people, probably a couple million people or more in India doing work that would have previously been done in the United States. So the reality is that kind of macroeconomic conditions have kind of the middle class has kind of eroded there. And the nature of things like technology is in many respects becomes essentially a little bit of a winner-take-all business, because with software there's essentially zero marginal cost to reproduce it. Google puts up a website, and the more searches they get, it doesn't really cost them much to handle more searches. And in fact, the more searches they get, the more accurate their searching becomes. So there are a lot of factors, I think, that are going into that. And if you're a local, you're trying to create a local environment that's going to be maximally inclusive, I think there's going to be some limits to what you can do. The most important thing, from my view on that, is not to create a cost profile in your community that makes it impossible for anything but high-end businesses to survive there. That's what coastal communities have done. They have very high housing costs, very high tax rates, very heavy regulatory burdens. And so, yes, if you're Goldman Sachs or Google, you could do very well in that environment. It doesn't affect you. If you are a manufacturer that's in a much more, in some other type of lower margin business, then that is really going to hurt. So I think, just from a local perspective, maintaining the cost profile, is important there. And again, looking at the potential industries that you can attract, what are they? They don't, and that's where a lot of communities really are thinking exclusively about high-end knowledge economy, biotech, high tech, green energy, et cetera. Well, what are the other pieces of industry that could be potentially attracted there that may have a more more middle class, more educationally inclusive participation? I think those are things that should be looked into. So in the case of Indianapolis, I mean, a lot of their entertainment-oriented businesses, they're lower wage, but they also allow people without the highest skills to get jobs there. They have a lot of distribution centers there, still do manufacturing there. So there's definitely problems with income inequality in almost every city. And I don't think that that's one that can ease. I don't think there's an easy silver bullet at the local level to deal with that, because it's a result of bigger trends.
Oh, that's a whole nother podcast about how do we separate what localities should be focused on versus what federal and international bodies should be focused on. But we'll kind of leave that on the table for the moment. I wonder if,
Right.
unless you want to go to it, but I wonder if you could share with us when you travel. I think you travel a fair bit for your work, and you go to these different communities. What do you look for when you come into a new community that lets you know how well that community is doing, whether it's thriving or not?
Well, I will say, I always say you can tell an awful lot about a community by just looking around. A lot of people who, journalists, traditionally trained journalists, spend a lot of time on the phone. They spend a lot of time doing interviews. They spend a lot of time on the people side of the equation. I tend to just, I do some of that, but I tend to spend more time looking at data and then actually just driving around and looking at things. So I like to, that's why when I travel to a city, I like to rent a car. And, even if I'm just going to be in a downtown area, I'm going to rent a car and I'm just going to drive around. I typically look for all the main arterials in the city and I just drive them from end to end, often from way out into the suburbs there. And I'll look for little interesting stores, or maybe I try to go into a little diner or a restaurant in a neighborhood and just see what's up. I just like to explore around and see what's there. But there's no substitute for actually seeing a community. What it looks like, I think, tells you a lot about it. Maybe you don't want to judge a book by its cover, but I think there is a sense in which there. And I do like to travel because I don't. I don't like to write about too many places, or try to come up with insights where I'm not like actually out in the locations. And it's very easy. I'm from a rural area, so I sort of have culturally connected to the heartland of America. But it's very easy to sit in New York and make pronouncements about the world. But when you start going to places, I'm in Akron, I'm in Grand Rapids. I'm in Chicago. I'm in these different cities. I spent time upstate in Buffalo. Providence, Rhode Island. You drive around, go around the country, and just see what America looks like. Go visit like what the more average communities in America look like, which are very different from New York City. And I think that's really important to keeping grounded when you're thinking about public policy. If you're just sitting in D.C. and New York or San Francisco, you're really having an experience that is far outside the norm of the average American community.
As we kind of bring ourselves to a close here, I wonder if you could share kind of something that you've learned along the way that was of doing this work that's been unexpected, or something that has kind of changed your perspective on things.
Yeah, well, one thing, as I learned about the city, one of the things I would say, there is tremendous cultural inertia in places. Inertia is, I think, something that we have a tendency to underestimate in cities, both cultural inertia and sort of like economic and financial inertia. So the founding of a place, the cultural founding of a place, has profound consequences for how that place works well into the future. So, I'm from southern Indiana, which was mostly settled by a combination of, people coming down the Ohio River and people migrating up from the upland south. And it still has that very southern feel to it today. It's not really the South, but there's a lot of southern aspects to it, and a lot of cultural commonalities. You can think about a place like Grand Rapids. It was sort of settled by the Dutch. There's still a tremendous amount of Dutch influence there. Also in New York, the Dutch influence from the settling of New York City. It's just an open, globally oriented, mercantilist culture, maybe similar to like Amsterdam in its heyday. That sort of mentality. I don't want to get to make too many absolute proclamations, but there may be something to that. And then also I think a lot of times we tend to hear people make kind of proclamations of doom about cities. People have been talking about the decline of Detroit since 1960. I think Time Magazine did a big article in 1960 on them and their troubles. And the reality is it took 50, 60 years for the city to go bankrupt. And so we read a lot today about pension problems and other issues. I think there's I can't remember who made it. There's some quote. There's a lot of ruin in a nation or something like that. And I think that can happen in a place. You can tend to go on a lot longer than we think that they're capable of going on, both good and bad. Things do change, but it often takes a very, very much longer period of time to change than we think. We don't always want to think about the fact that you're talking, 30 to 40 years to transform a community, but unfortunately, I think that's to some extent reality.
Well, as you have looked at all these places and been everywhere, I wonder if you could kind of share a story to close us out that shares what can happen when a community does that long-term work and works on that 30 to 40-year timeline and is able to create the kind of change that winds up with positive results.
Well, one community I always like to highlight because it's like a parallel universe to the rest of the Midwest is Columbus, Indiana. Columbus is a city of around 40,000 people, 45,000 people, I think. It's 45 minutes south of Indianapolis. It is just a blue-collar manufacturing city. It doesn't have a university there. It's not the state capital. And yet it's an extremely prosperous city. And in part, that's because they do have a Fortune 500 company that's based there, Cummins Engine. And going back even into the 40s, but especially in the post-war era, the CEO of Cummins, a guy by the name of J. Irwin Miller, basically, essentially like a lot of town father type people back then, it was essentially the dictator of the town, effectively. And he just sort of made a series of investments that put that town on a different connection. One, the culture of Cummins Engine has been like a legacy culture of American business, and that they can remain very much involved in investing in the communities they're in. They have high community investment. But one of the things Miller did was he said, if you pick an architect off of my list, I will pay the architecture fees for any school that you want to build. And it morphed into any civic building in the city. And his architect list was people like Eero Saarinen, Cesar Pelli, Harry Weiss, people like that. So basically, because of Cummins and Miller, Columbus, Indiana has one of the best collections of modernist architecture in the entire world. It's a world-famous architectural destination. There are 6 National Historic Landmark buildings there. The American Institute of Architects listed it as the 6th best architectural destination in the United States. But it's still overwhelmingly a manufacturing town. They've got more Japanese-owned firms doing business there than in any city in Indiana other than Indianapolis, which is probably 20 times the size. They've got Chinese firms there, Canadian firms, German firms. The amount of foreign business that's set up there doing manufacturing is ridiculous. And they've continued to invest in their historic core and many other things. And that investment in the quality of place over a very long period of time, essentially by enlightened business leadership that remained committed to the town, I think really made a really big difference for them as an example of what can happen. And I think the knock on them, you would try to say is, well, they have this big Fortune 500 company there. But what I would say is if the community, there's a lot of places that used to have them and don't anymore. The fact that company remained viable in that city was because of the investments. And in fact, the reason that Miller invested in the schools is he realized if I need to attract engineers to my community in order to design these high-tech engines, this is in the 50s, he's like, they're never going to come here if the schools are terrible. So we need to convince them that we have good schools, and the best way to do that is to build a really nice building. And so that was part of his strategy to attract talent back then, and it worked.
That's a great example to end on. I wonder, Aaron, if people are interested in learning more about what you have to say and following you, where can they find more information?
But most of my stuff ends up on my personal website, which is urbanophile.com. It's the word urban, the letter O, and then phile.com, the lover of cities. As I say, I love cities like only someone from a town of 29 people can. So you'll find all my work there.
Wonderful. And if anybody's interested in more information about CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com. But thank you so much for taking the time today, Aaron.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. We truly hope you've enjoyed today's episode and come away thinking more deeply about something than you were before. If you have, we'd appreciate a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you might be listening to this. It really helps other people find out about the podcast and the great guests that we have on. Further, I'd like to welcome all of you all to check us out on CityWorks XPO, that's cityworksxpo.com, and learn about our annual gathering, CityWorks 8, where this year's theme is Anticipating 2050, Acting Today. We're really excited about what we have going on this year and some of the speakers that we have coming in, and we hope you'll join us in Roanoke, Virginia from October 4th through 6th and be part of what's really a very special event. But for now, thanks again for listening and have a great week.